Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for this workshop on the new Flute Series 4 gradebooks released by AMEB at the end of 2022. My name is Stephen Hodgson, and I'm the Head of Publishing and Syllabus Development at AMEB. And very shortly, Jocelyn Fazzone, our Specialist Consultant for the new AMEB Series 4 Flute books, will be presenting a workshop on the contents of those books. As the gradebook consultant for these publications, Jocelyn not only had primary responsibility for the selection of the pieces that appear in the book, but also for carefully editing each piece, specifying tempi, breathing marks, editorial dynamics and articulations, and so on. Jocelyn has also written the performance notes that appear at the end of each piece, isolating particular challenges or performance considerations that the work presents, and offering strategies for the teacher or player. Although Jocelyn had primary responsibility for the contents of these books, we must also thank Peter Bartels, who was tasked with reviewing each selection in detail. As the primary consultant for the current flute technical work, we really couldn't ask for a better devil's advocate, in Peter's own words, to scrutinize every piece proposed for the series. If you have any questions throughout the course of this workshop, please feel free to type them into the chat at the bottom of your Zoom window, or use the Q&A function there. We'll do our very best to answer them either during the course of the workshop if possible, or at the end if time permits. We'll leave a little bit of time aside for that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our flute gradebook consultant for Series 4. Jocelyn Fazzone has had a long and multifaceted musical career. She is a well-known teacher of flute and has received many awards for her teaching achievements from AMEB New South Wales. She teaches flute for the Sydney Conservatorium High School, has a large private teaching studio, and has taught for the University of New South Wales, Wesley Institute, and Sydney Conservatorium Open Academy. She is the AMEB New South Wales Chief Woodwind Examiner and Federal AMEB Examiner, and frequently adjudicates for music competitions around Sydney. Jocelyn has performed on flute with the Sydney, Queensland and Tasmanian Symphony Orchestras and the Australian Opera and Ballet Orchestra. She is a founding member of the Windfall Sextet and frequently works coaching chamber music for the Amateur Chamber Music Society and Conservatorium High School. She has appeared as featured presenter on aspects of flute pedagogy and in performance masterclasses for the Australian Flute Festivals, Flute Society of New South Wales and Sydney Conservatorium, and has been an invited guest presenter for the Victorian Flute Guild and Flute Society of South Australia. Her career has also included the role of associate artist or piano accompanist with many of Australia's leading flute players. She has made a number of recordings of flute and piano repertoire and has also recorded for Fine Music and the ABC. She has authored and co-authored 9 volumes of flute materials, including repertoire, studies, teaching material, and a pedagogical book on flute teaching. Jocelyn studied flute and piano with some of the world's most distinguished teachers and has performance degrees in flute from Australia, Switzerland, and the USA. Welcome, Jocelyn. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll now hand over to you for the AMEB Flute Series 4 Teachers Workshop.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here and so exciting that we have these books up and running and presumably to become familiar with those. It's been a really interesting creative process, choosing the repertoire for the books. Overall, I had 3 considerations along with numerous smaller considerations, which I'll explain now. So always there was the consideration that every piece had to be worthy compositionally and of good educational merit. Every piece had to be enjoyable for students to play, along with teachers to teach. And thirdly, that one of my most important fundamentals was that there was a great deal of stylistic diversity. Now, in addition to these overall elements, The educational merit considerations were numerous, covering things like appropriate instrumental range, the keys for the key signatures and time signatures, and the variation of those within each list, because I didn't want students to miss out on the opportunity of playing in, say, 3/4 in different lists rather than 4/4, etc. I've chosen pieces with a variety of tempi, appropriate rhythmic elements for the grade level, and dynamics and articulation suitable to the grades. In addition, pieces had to be of an appropriate length with playable piano parts, with an overall aim of developing the level, starting off through preliminary up to grade 4 and then next year grade 6. As I said, there are many styles represented in the books, all the way back to Renaissance, Baroque, Galant style, classical, through romantic, and all the contemporary styles that I could find and were appropriate. So we've got some rock, blues, swing, little jazz moments there, some ragtime and 20th century classical, along with traditional folk music from around various parts of the world. Within each grade, you'll see there is some variation of level, but still remaining within the parameters of the grade, which I think is necessary as we have students developing at different aspects of their playing at different levels. And not only that, the range of students that we're teaching ranges from the absolute musical beginner to more sophisticated older adults or young people who've already learned piano or other. We're very fortunate to have 5 pieces in every list, so we have great choice, and this gives the students and teachers the opportunity of learning more than the basic 3 or 4 pieces for each exam. And you'll notice that we have quite a few duets in each grade level, and students are therefore able to enjoy their playing with their teacher, work on ensemble skills. Somebody's having a bit of trouble hearing me. It's fading in and out. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'll leave Steve to address that, and I'll try and speak quite slowly and clearly. So, looking at my sources for the material, I've got a large music library at home, so I started with that. Went to various publishing houses, Hal Leonard, AMEB Federal Collection. Music stores such as Lane Cove Music were very helpful, as was the Sydney Conservatorium Library. IMSLP website was terrific, and the Australian Music Centre and Wirrapat. Just noting that there's good representation from female composers and Australian composers in every volume, and the inclusion of some well-known pieces to encourage students to expand their musical knowledge. Okay, so that was the background to the creation and selection of pieces. I'm just going to highlight now some special moments within each grade, although anyone who knows me will realise that I could talk about every piece with great excitement. Starting with preliminary, I know with my own teaching experience that the range is very important at this level. So you'll find a number of pieces within this grade and grade 1 don't go all the way up to middle G, because some students are slower to learn to overblow and sustain the second register. This is also in grade 1. First of all, I'd like to highlight the very first piece in preliminary, which is Camboji Sings by Brunsden. And this is a great starter piece, ideal for really new beginners, not sophisticated, just a very pretty piece with a small range. It's rhythmically repetitive and has predictable slurs, no D to E fingerings. So quite manageable for the student. Good for working on breath placement with the anacrusis. It features non-Western tonality, which I've tried to include where possible. Moving on to the Melting Ice Cream by Ross Edwards, one of our more beautiful pieces and a trickier piece for this level, requiring great breath control, smooth air and big breaths. It uses the upper notes in the range for this grade in a sustained way, which makes it more challenging. The key signature, which includes C sharp, is not strictly speaking a key signature for this grade, but the note C sharp is within the technical requirements for the grade. So all the duet features apply to this piece, and it's very beautiful and will certainly appeal to slightly more sophisticated students. Also from List A in preliminary is Working on the Railway, which appeals to the other end of the musical spectrum. That is great, broad, general appeal and lots of fun. Presenting 6/8 time with quite simple rhythmic elements. It works on the higher notes, but in staccato, which is much easier. And we have some coordination with fingers here between D and E. So preliminary List B, lots of great pieces here. The Mozart piece, Can You Dance, encourages students to already think one in a bar and to incorporate that graceful and elegant classical style, incorporating also the dotted rhythm in 3/4 time, which is quite a learning step for students of this level. It has a small range though, and is quite easy for breathing requirements. The Branley Double of Pretorius is the next one I'd like to talk about, and this piece is one of the harder ones for preliminary. I have included in all grades slightly more challenging pieces. In my mind, I call them challenge pieces to cater for the huge range of students that we see. So we've got longer phrases, slightly longer breaths, more complex changes of fingering and mixed articulations in that one. We have the Three Ravens next, the traditional folk song, which is one of the easier pieces for the grade. Small range and all tongued for those students struggling with certain elements. But we do have your dotted rhythms here. This one requires some counting of rests, which is an important aspect, as we know, but gives students an opportunity to develop their expressive capabilities and introducing the concept of harmonic, melodic, natural minors at the end. List C, I had a lot of fun choosing List C pieces because there's so much scope here. We have Happy Dance, Sad Song by Bartok, introducing the 2/4 time signature. And students can work on changing the mood of the piece and the management of writs and our tempos, different note lengths and signs, musical terminology with staccatos, longer staccatos, tenutos and slurs, and some dynamic challenges. The second piece is The Daybreak by Fisher, which is fun. I'm sure this will be a very popular choice for students. In the rock style, and has some finger changes to watch out for, the D, E flat, E notes and syncopations, and necessitates students being able to vary their note lengths. So the beginning, long, short. That sort of thing, which they will find challenging, as it implies an ability to sustain completely through crotchets. And lastly, in the preliminary list C, I'd like to present the Jiangsu folk song, which is an easier choice also. Very appealing. I'm sure the students will recognize the beauty and will be enthralled by the pentatonic aspect and the sort of multicultural idea of this piece. Rest counting as well is important in this piece. Now, we're moving on to grade 1. My challenge piece from this grade was the very first piece, the theme from Melusina's Dream. Lovely snippet, I should say, from a larger work titled Melusina's Dream by Australian composer Christine Draeger. I'm sure this piece will be very appealing to students, although it has some little challenges. So the short little trills, which are described in the music, some interesting dynamic contrasts, slurs onto beats instead of tonguing the downbeat, and more complex rhythms within the 6/8 time signature now. It uses the full extent of the range as well. The second piece I'd like to feature here is the study by Garibaldi, which is the first in the with the idea of presenting the romantic style flute studies, which is so important in the overall flute repertoire. So we've got the 3/4 time signature here, and one of the reasons I chose this piece is because of the all too common problem that students have of adding a 4th beat to the bar when there's a 3/4 time signature. So this is what we have. Etc. And we all know that students love to go etc. This should teach them a good deal about that. Necessitates good airflow between registers and some longer slurred phrases, along with those tricky fingerings again. Okay, moving on now to the third selection from grade 1, list A, which is the Haydn theme. And this little snippet gives students an opportunity to develop their breath-supported staccatos, which we would call détaché, and to work on their chromatic fingering from B to E, in which we see often so many errors. The students have the opportunity of aligning their breath placements with the anacrusis in the phrases. But for the more struggling type of student, it has a small range. It's lots of fun, lots of character. Okay, we're moving on now to list B in grade 2. And I'd like to just present Simple Gifts, which has a small, well, I should say a lower range than the very upper notes of the grade, and that was done deliberately. And this will give students an opportunity to try and achieve a little more legato in their tonguing. So, that sort of thing, and we all know that students at this level tend to play very chopped up. That type of thing. Students get to work on their phrasing and expression and their rest counting as well, but they should be very engaged with this piece as it's such a beautiful tune. The next piece to feature in this list is the Monzani French Air. Also another piece with a slightly smaller range. The dotted rhythms are the teacher's bane for many years, so important aspect of choosing this piece. We've got the dotted rhythm quaver to semiquaver, as well as the dotted rhythm crotchet to quaver, and that students clearly define the dotted quaver to semiquaver rather, and the equal quavers. They get to practice their acciaccaturas and their pauses and leading in. But the character of this piece is very catchy, and I'm sure students will be engaged with this. The next one is the Rameau tambourin, and this introduces the cut common time and the idea of the anacrusis, which is a minim. And so many of our Baroque pieces have this aspect to them. Now, this piece can be looked upon as an extension piece for trills. So the trills here are not compulsory. The student may play without trills, with some trills, or with all trills for those developmental things. Some students find it very exciting playing trills at this level, and others are turned off. And this will appeal to students working on their graceful and charming characters. List C. I've chosen to talk about the Spanish Lullaby by Caldry. When students look at staccatos, they tend to play quite short and always in a rather sort of fun way. But the title Lullaby means that they're going to play with a more expressive sense of the lifting. That sort of thing, and that teaches them a great deal about the variety of lifted notes. The major-minor aspect of this piece also teaches them a little more about keys and tonalities. It's a very beautiful piece which gives the students, we hope, opportunity to control the sharpness of the C sharp, as well as incorporating some further dynamics. The next piece to focus here is The Easy Winners by Jocelyn, which I'm sure will be a great favourite, the catchy ragtime. One of the main teaching elements that we have to grapple with, rather, I should say, is the slurring onto the beat as opposed to slurring from the beat, and students who mix up rhythms with slurs. And that's exactly what this is about frequently. So in the second bar of the flute part, we're going to get all sorts of situations happening in lessons there, I'm sure. This piece has a small range, which is quite a useful thing as well. The next piece is the Sleeping Beauty's Pavane, which will appeal to the more sophisticated student and give them an opportunity to work on expression, long phrases, and really smooth air. And it can be quite challenging at this level. The student will also get the opportunity to work on their softer dynamic range, and hopefully, as you'll see in some of the program notes, performance notes rather, start thinking about keeping the pitch up in the softs, even if they're not yet able to do so. Now, moving on to the next grade, grade 2. We've got 3 duets in this grade, which was deliberately done because it's at this level of playing where the going starts getting a bit tougher, that students can lose interest. And we all know that duets is a great way to work on with students like this. So the first piece to have a look at is the Footloose on Friday. So obviously, students are going to be working on their even fingering, on going a bit faster now, and their tricky fingering changes, along with slurring the air between the registers and some dynamics. It's in the natural minor, also instructive for students at this level. Moving on to the second piece to talk about in that list is Bonaparte's Grand March by Graupner, and I'm certain this will be a very popular one. It's not musically sophisticated, but there are some tricky elements in there. So we've got the precision of the dotted rhythms, along with putting in the turns, which some students will find quite tricky. And it teaches them in this march style with the dotted rhythms to be able to lift the notes to give the piece that extra character. The third piece from this list to have a look at is the Waltzlet by Moa, and Moa has written a lot of really fun pieces for kids. This one is no exception. So they're looking at swinging the rhythms here, and they need to be very familiar with that because it's part of today's musical palette, so to speak, and they have to do that a lot in their school band. You've got your long, short notes with your tenutos, long slurs and syncopations here. So the list B, choices in grade 2. Little Freddie's Birthday of Mozart is a fairly well-known piece, and students can work on their cantabile, a little more sophistication needed, and some degree of control over the sound needed as well. So for some grade 2 students, they'll find this quite challenging. Even if they don't present it for their exam, I do find that teaching them a piece like this helps their development without having to be examined on that. They get to work on their expression and phrasing, and legato in the second and third registers, and with breath control which comes with that, and the faster fingering on the high notes in the semiquavers, which is by no means easy. The Ranish Minuet is a lot of fun with the double appoggiaturas, and that's another new thing that we have been able to introduce here. The correct Baroque trill, that is starting on the upper note, are absolutely doable in this particular piece. And that, just a little word about the trills. Most of the pieces have got written out instructions, so to speak, of how to play the trills, with some of the pieces with the Baroque option and then an easier option. And that's an educational thing to teach students what a correct Baroque trill is. But at faster speeds, it's probably not going to be doable for them. Also in this piece, you've got little rhythmic things that they can learn. That is the snap rhythms of the two semiquavers quaver, as opposed to the triplet at the ending. This piece has a smaller range, and therefore it can focus on slightly more difficult concepts at the same time. Now, a personal favourite of mine is the Jigger by Schicart, which has got short phrases, is really fun to play, cycles through many chord and key changes, which will keep students on their feet. Rapid dynamic changes as well. Thumb sliding is there, so ideally they would use their thumb B flat and then slide off as needed and back on again. A little trick in this piece is the high D towards the end, which is a slight breath challenge at this level and very much a counting challenge. Moving on to list C, starting with the Farandole by Bizet, were very well-known piece, and I've found by examining clarinet students that these students absolutely love playing this. So it's a terrific inclusion for that reason. The double dotting is something new, and they'll be able to learn from that along with retaining the very strict dotted rhythms. It's good for the slight contrast of character between the two sections as well. The next piece I'd like to highlight is The Dancing Lorikeets by Carolyn Morris. This piece was specially composed for this book, so great thank you to Carolyn, who's written some wonderful music for students. And many of the pieces within the books, you will have noticed already, have descriptive titles and appeal to the imagination of students, helping them to interpret some features of this piece, like the legato and staccato contrasts, and particularly that subito piano in bar 25 will be a learning experience for the students. The third piece to talk about in this list is The Sea Chant by Peter Sculthorpe, and this is such a beautiful piece, perhaps for the slightly more sophisticated student as well. So it presents even more complexity in terms of rhythm within the 6/8 time signature. So you've got those snap rhythms, quaver, crotchet, and the dotted rhythms, and some reasonably tricky counting challenges involving tied notes. So it represents the music from a bygone era, really, this piece, with some contemporary flavours and harmonies, which is quite interesting. Students need to develop the ability to sustain in the third register and some reasonable control also at slightly softer dynamics. They have the opportunity also of changing the character somewhat in the Meno Mosso section, which I've talked about in the performance notes down below. Now, we're moving on to grade 3. And the first piece I'd like to talk about is the Garibaldi Study, which is a very charming piece indeed, carrying on through the romantic study vein. Should be very appealing to students and has a lot of focus on the upper register, fingerings and so on. But of particular interest to teachers will be the articulation patterns, which start from bar 27. And I'll just play that. That again involves sometimes slurring from a beat and sometimes slurring onto a beat. And that's going to trick many a student up, but also be very good for them. Then the Caprice by Quantz, and just a word about my inclusions in list A. I've included pieces from a whole range of styles and eras, and the Quantz obviously falls into that category. What we're looking for here, and will be challenging for students, is the ability to match the dotted rhythms throughout the piece, despite some of the fingering changes. Another aspect which is great for their learning is how to do the appoggiatura in bar 8, which as described is a long appoggiatura. Like that. And in fact, that's just a signed version of the rhythms in bars 10 and 12. The trills from the upper note should also be quite doable in this piece because they're on longer notes. It's a fun piece with lots of character. Also in grade 3, I'd like to talk about the James Ray From Another Planet, very quirky piece. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of interest in this piece. I love the chromatic line which underpins the starting phrase going down from the G sharp, G, F sharp, F, E, D sharp. Another good feature of this piece is the direct octave transposition down there at bar 9, which we need to do so many times as flute players, and students can get terribly mixed up with their fingerings and overblowing or underblowing when doing this. So another thing that this piece works on is the response of the staccatos in the lower octave from bar 9. Now, some Liszt B pieces from grade 3. Well, the Kuhlau Allegro might be familiar with some of our more experienced, that's that's parentheses, older teachers, because it used to be in, a version of this used to be in, I think, sonatinas for the flute player, perhaps. Anyway, we've got our own version here, and it's most charming piece in which students get to play a faster tempo piece with a lot of expression, a lot of delicacy, and a lot of detail which is required in this style. So students need to work on their rhythmic subdivisions, quavers, triplets, semiquavers, as well as being able to tie with that. The second piece to talk about here is the Birdcatcher's Song, so famous, and I have taught this piece now a few times, and the students just love playing this. So we have demi-semiquavers introduced now. They can use their imagination. And bars 27 to 32 teaches the students that they are now accompaniment rather than tune, which passes to the piano. The tempo diminuetto of Rouge or Ruga is a great fun piece with the lilting one in a bar again. The opportunity for Baroque appoggiaturas, triplets, and in particular the leaping between the registers down the bottom of the piece will be quite challenging and a great skill to start learning. The Liszt C, the first piece I'll just say a few words about is the Air de Ballet of Chaminade. And this is certainly a challenge piece for this grade, requiring so much detail and romantic elegance. The lightness and the lyricism that's required. So it's a long piece. It has breath challenges and challenges within the range because it really does exploit the full range of the instrument. Likewise, the descending large slurs will be challenging to some. It teaches the students about the pacing and skills needed in the pauses, as there are quite a few of these. So the second piece to feature is Grandmother Tells a Ghost Story by Kulak. So this will really spark the imagination of students, and there's much to say in it. Students will be challenged a little by the ascending octave slurs in bars 9, 11 and 12. And students are required to have pretty good low note development here too, particularly in the staccatos. Many small details in this piece, but I'm sure it will be very engaging to students. Finally, for this grade, the piece by Hilary Taggart, Gustav, it's a piece of great simple charm, featuring big slurs, needing tone control as you go from low to high, and so on. But in particular, it's rhythmically a very instructive piece, as students have to immediately contrast their rhythms between the dotted rhythm and the equal quavers. Finally, we're moving on to grade 4. This grade has a greater number of the traditional type of romantic studies, and partly that is, I have done that because students really do need to be developing their technique at this level in order to prepare them for more advanced repertoire coming up. But focusing first of all on the Stomping Flute by Bullard, and this will certainly appeal to the less sophisticated student as well as the more sophisticated, as it has great character and is lots of fun. The particular challenge in this is the pattern of slurring with the dotted rhythm across the beats and students being able to retain the sense of the beat. The syncopations and changing the character to a more elegant, expressive character in the middle section. This also gives students, with the right teacher, the opportunity of controlling the sharp pitch on the forte high E flat. We hope that they do that. Secondly, I'd like a little feature on the Drouet study, which is one of the romantic studies. So this piece features that wedge sort of staccato, the Keeler, German type of staccato, which implies a little more character. And the Polonaise character here presents a wonderful opportunity for students with a lot of flair. And etc. They'll really enjoy playing this, I'm sure. On to the beat slurs abound in this. We're looking for even fingering and correct fingering at the same time. And lastly in this list, we've got the Cat on the Corner, another evocative piece by James Ray. Swing style again, with lots of appoggiaturas and syncopations and a wide dynamic range. Students are able to do the little glissando falls, that sort of thing, which they always very much enjoy. Also, the necessity for good control over the low notes within the staccato. Moving on to the list B choices here. The Scherzo of J.C.F. Bach is a very charming piece, that light, elegant, early classical style in which students have to learn to match their note lengths and shape their phrases with more detail, the little trills and so on. And there's a fair bit of interplay at times with the piano part, so they have to listen and be aware of the ensemble here. The Haydn Allegro, again, has got that wedge type of articulation, which implies the character, the characterized staccatos, that sort of thing. Great practice for their acciacchaturas. And lots of finger challenges in this towards the end of the piece, with some more complex across the beat articulations and some interval challenges from bar 42 for the next couple of bars. Okay, and finally, list C. Oh no, I've got one more I want to talk about in the list B, and that is the Largo Allegro of Loewe in the high Baroque style. Important to include some pieces like this, as they're an important part of flute repertoire. So by this stage, grade 4, we're looking for the ability to play truly legato in the first movement rather than chopped up. That sort of thing, and the ability to shape the ends of the phrases and pay attention, hopefully, to the intonation. The Allegro requires a lot of precision in terms of matching note lengths. It's got quite a few finger challenges in it, and really represents that typical Baroque feature of unequal and rather unusual phrase lengths. Now we're moving to list C, and we have the Morceau de Concours by Delibes, which is their first foray really into that lighter French late 19th century, early 20th century genre. Contrasting expression in this is fabulous, as are the rhythmic challenges with the tied crotchet to semiquavers, a bit of a feature here. Makes full use of the range again, lots of finger work to be practiced, the chromatic scales, the high note fingerings, and the detail in holding that sustained note at the end and hopefully in tune for that. Contrasting that, we have the Chatterbox Rag by Elena Katz-Chernin, which is going to engage all students, I'm sure. Such a fun piece. Technically challenging, not so easy, particularly with the multitude of offbeat accents, note lengths, but they'll love doing the glissando at the end of the piece. And the final piece that I want to focus on right now is the piece by Pamela Wedgwood, Falling, which is just quite simply a most beautiful piece in that rather cafe soiree type of mood, slight jazz or blues chords, harmonies, and again should appeal to the more sophisticated students who need really good control over the breaths, good control over the softer notes in higher notes. And I have had students of that slightly more sophisticated ability play this piece and really love it. Now, so I think what we might do is go over to Steve and have a look and maybe respond to some of the queries or comments that people have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Jocelyn. There have been a few questions that have come through that I'll just touch on briefly, but now is the time if anybody has particular questions to send them through, either through the webinar chat or through the Q&A function. We'll monitor both of those over the next 5 minutes or so. But I'll just quickly flick through some of the early questions. Again, apologies for those audio issues. I hope the rest of the presentation worked better for everybody. We had a comment from Linda about including more female composers and Australian composers. I did just want to touch on that briefly. This is a real priority for us moving forwards. For all AMEB resources and syllabuses, we work hard to make sure that there is representation from Australian composers and also composers who are not necessarily male. Trying to include more diversity in our lists and resources is really important to AMEB as an organization. There were a couple of questions. One question about whether there will ever be a flute for leisure syllabus. This is something that was talked about really seriously a number of years ago, when, around about the time that the flute syllabus was last fully reviewed. And the decision was made to diversify the repertoire represented on the syllabus rather than create a separate flute for leisure syllabus. At the time, the discussion was had between a number of flute specialists around the country, and it was felt that the basic technical requirements for playing the flute at each level would be more or less the same, and that it would be a better outcome to just diversify the repertoire on the syllabus rather than create a separate for leisure flute syllabus. We've had a couple of questions about recordings. So this is something I wanted to announce and reinforce. We have flute recorded accompaniments for Series 4, which will be released from preliminary through to grade 3. We are currently just in the final phases of editing these recorded accompaniments. They're out. They should be out for release within a few weeks. So please do stay tuned for those. Recorded accompaniments for preliminary through to grade 3. And those are able to be used, of course, for practice purposes and for educational purposes, but also in the exam if that's a better option for you. The duet parts. So AMEB have started including works that have duet parts for the same instrument so that students can play along with their teachers in a number of syllabuses. So there's certainly quite a few in the new violin grade books, in the trombone grade books, trumpet grade books. All of the series that we've released recently have included some sort of duet material. Jocelyn, it's only list A's that have duets in flute, isn't it?
That's correct, Steve. And that is because all of the list B and C, and when we get to the grades 5 and 6 books later at the end of the year, they are all accompanied by piano. So there won't be any unaccompanied list D pieces.
Great. So importantly, those duet parts are for practice purposes only. In examination, candidates will need to present those works unaccompanied, and the duet flute parts are really just there, or the second flute parts are really just there for in the teaching studio or for performing away from an examination, but all of those works are intended to be performed unaccompanied in the exam itself. We have a question about printing in black, the articulation and dynamics. I think this is always a good opportunity to reinforce our approach here. And the AMEB style is to include in black the dynamics and articulations and tempo markings, etc., where those were either the original marks of the composer or in some cases the original marks of the arranger. And where articulations and dynamics appear in grey, or what we call a stippled font, that is to indicate that those are editorial dynamics, editorial tempo marks suggested by our consultant, in this case, Jocelyn, of course. And we distinguish between the two, where the markings appear in black and reflect the composer's original markings. Those are intended to be a pretty solid guide. You'd want to incorporate those markings in examination. Where they're in grey, it's to indicate that they're a suggestion. They may be one of many solutions, but they're really to help with creating a sense of style. They're there to help the students and teachers who may not be particularly familiar with that style or that particular piece, just to give a little bit of extra guidance rather than just plain notes on the page. Did you have anything to add about that, Jocelyn?
So just to reinforce what Steve said, where the markings are in black, they really are expected to be played like that with the students. Where they're in grey, they're recommended, but not 100% obligatory by any means, although I've given a lot of thought to these and feel that they are the best options. There will perhaps be other options. Students in exams won't be penalised, certainly, by not following the grey markings.
That's right. So a couple of other questions that have come through just before we wrap up. Will the accompaniments be available as digital downloads? Yes, they will. Now, we currently have a situation where we can't put our recorded accompaniments up on Spotify and some streaming services because they're missing the melody line. Those streaming services won't allow those to be posted there. We used to put everything up on Spotify and on Apple Music and a range of different streaming services. Unfortunately, we can no longer do that. So the easiest way of accessing those will be through the AMEB website. They should come through within the next few weeks, and we'll certainly make that known through our Facebook page and in any way that we can possibly communicate as soon as they are released. There won't be recordings of the full works released as AMEB recordings, although of course a number of these pieces have existing recordings that you can access online in various different ways.
Sorry, Steve. just a word about that. As the books become more and more known, students and teachers love to put their own versions up, so they'll certainly be found.
And we are looking at different options. Obviously, nowadays, recording, making available many recordings is an extremely resource-heavy activity, and AMEB as a not-for-profit organisation can't always provide full sets of recordings for everything in the gradebooks, but we're looking for ways of making that more achievable as time goes on. Something for you, Jocelyn, when do you expect good use of vibrato?
It's so variable. Some kids will have a very nice natural vibrato by grade 2 or 3 or 4. Some will have to be totally 100% instructed on vibrato, and that process is probably, depending on the student and the control they have over the sound and breathing, will start perhaps during grades 5 and 6. Very individual.
And not something to be forced as well. I'd have to double check. There is a point at which, well, I believe there's a point at which a developing and developed vibrato is expected in examination. That will be in the list of objectives.
It is grade level, but it says by the end of level 2. So if a student isn't ready yet to do vibrato in grade 5, absolutely fair enough.
Yeah. Thanks, Jocelyn. Just checking to see if there was anything else. There was a question about the Drouet, and I'm just going to answer that now, whether there was an accidental typo in bar 23 of the Drouet. There are divergent sources of that particular study. We looked at a number of them, and the early sources, we are faithful to the early editions of that work. Subsequent editions have introduced other accidentals and other little inflections, but we've really gone with the early editions of that work. I thought it was best to answer that here. Bear with me one moment, I'll see what else we've got. A lot of support for the selection of pieces. Thank you, Jocelyn. Questions about whether grades 5 and 6 will be coming? Yes, absolutely. Jocelyn, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Okay, well, we're in the process of types. The pieces have been chosen. We're in the process of the typesetting, editing, performance notes, and so on. And equally, they're going to be wonderful. I'm very excited about them.
Yes, look, these publications, there's a vast amount of work behind them in terms of research phases, finding appropriate sources. The editing is extremely time consuming. And so grades 5 and 6 are being worked on right now. They won't be released before November, but we're looking forward to a release in November of the grade 5 and 6 books. They'll look very similar. They'll have the same kind of cover, but we're very excited about those. We can't release much information about those right now, just because the approval process hasn't gone too far yet, but we're working on those, and hopefully everybody can forgive us for releasing those a little bit later this year.
Actually, it's gone along the exact same lines, so we've got a lot of variety in there, some small divergency within the parameter of the grades, and so on and so forth.
That's great. Just looking through a few more questions, we'll wrap up very shortly. Is the technical work due to be updated as well? The technical work is remaining stable for now. So this was the aim of this project was to introduce a new set of grade books to the existing syllabus, so that teachers and students have another range of repertoire to choose from, but the technical work is not being altered at this point in time. It does mean that you can use this book in combination with the old series of books. So Series 4 and Series 3 are both current on the flute syllabus. So if there are favorites from Series 3 that you want to keep teaching and keep playing, then that's absolutely fine. It's all on the current syllabus. This is just an additional resource. A question about tempo markings. Absolutely, a lot of time has been spent on the tempo markings, trying to make sure that, you know, there's always a little bit of to and fro with tempo markings. Pieces can be made to work in a variety of different tempos, and sometimes there's an ideal tempo that a professional would play that piece at, or a professional performer might play that piece at, and then a tempo that a student is able to reasonably manage. Jocelyn, did you have any input on that?
Yes. So the metronome markings are in A, which means it's an advisory thing. So if you have a student who simply can't do it at that advised tempo, don't worry, they should do it however they're able to do it. You'll notice that next to most of the tempos is CA, so it's roundabout. And some of the lower grades will have a tempo range as well.
If you do have any further questions, please do email them through. We'll send some communication after the end of this webinar through to the people that attended, and so you'll be able to respond to that communication. I just, in wrapping up, wanted to confirm the new Flute Series 4 gradebooks and other resources are available now via your local music shop, ameb.edu.au, and other online sheet music retailers. Again, I want to thank Jocelyn Fazzone, our gradebook consultant, and obviously the presenter for today's webinar. Peter Bartels, reviewer for the project, our typesetting and proofreading team, Project Officer Laura Vaughan, and the many Australian and international composers whose works make the gradebooks so very good. Thanks also to the behind-the-scenes team at AMEB, Bernard De Pasquale, AMEB CEO, and Helena Jones, Ketchy Annell, and Maxine Day for making this workshop possible. And lastly, but certainly not least, to everyone who has attended this workshop, either live or later online, thank you very much. We're very proud of the new AMEB Series 4 publications, and we hope that they serve the flute community as a useful and inspiring resource for years to come. Thanks again, and goodbye.